The Bachmann ON30 Shea is a beautiful little locomotive. I've had one since they first come out. I bought a second one just to weather for this video. Here you see the two. You'll notice how much easier it is to see the details on the one that's already weathered compared with the jet black one. Here I've adjusted the contrast a little bit so that it's easier to see the details on the black one, but still the details just don't stand out. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about how to change the stock ON30 Shea and make the colors so that they stand out better on our layouts. Layouts are very dark, so we have to overcompensate a little bit with our painting because it's just never as bright inside our layout rooms as it is outside. Now on the last video, if you remember, the lettering on the 260 tender came off just applying thinner. Well, on the ON30 Shea, it's a different type of lettering put on there. I tried thinner. Here I'm using some lighter fluid. This contains naphtha, which is usually pretty good at removing lettering. However, in this case it didn't work very well, so I just continued to apply it and lightly scrub it, and before long I was able to get it to come off a bit. But what I ended up doing was actually taking a toothpick here and you're rubbing the toothpick over the lettering in order to get it to come loose. Here is not a toothpick, this is a very short brush, but you can see that the paint is starting to loosen up on this and starting to lift off. If you don't want to apply your own lettering or your own decals, of course just use whatever the locomotive come with, and that's what most people do. They buy a certain railroad like the Southern Pacific or the Union Pacific, so they're not really concerned about removing the lettering. Sometimes you can buy unlettered locomotives, but in a situation like this I came across this one and it was lettered, and I wanted to show how to remove the lettering. Occasionally what works is just some very fine sandpaper, just lightly sand it, but you have to be very careful doing that. But just by being patient and working with the naphtha, and I'm showing it here the whole thing, you can see that as I continue to work with it, more and more the paint lifts off. But finally I just sort of gave up on doing it this way, and that's where I went with the actually taking a toothpick and rubbing a toothpick against it to get the lettering off. So here, working carefully with the toothpick, you'll see that I'm actually able to get most of it off, but even so it didn't come cleanly off, but it came off enough to obscure the letters. Of course, if you want, you can always overspray and have some of those old original lettering show through. Sheas were one of those locomotives that were traded and sold quite a bit, so in the lifetime of a typical Shea, it might have 3 or 4 different owners. So sometimes the old lettering would just show through. But by using a brush, a toothpick here, and then using a paper towel to clean it up, I could see that I was making progress, but it was taking quite a bit to get it done. So a little more firm work, and eventually I was able to do this, and the more I worked at it, the better it come off. So the point is that each locomotive that you have, if you want to remove the lettering, you need to experiment with different things in order to find out what will work, not with that particular brand of locomotive, but often what will work with that particular locomotive. So start with the most non-aggressive, ordinary Tester's paint thinner, and then try the naphtha. And after I was done with this, I could rub my finger across it and tell that it was quite smooth. There was no ridges or anything there from the lettering, so it was okay to go ahead and paint over it. Microscale makes a nice masking liquid that you can put over things like headlights and windows, things like that when you're going to spray a locomotive. And we are going to spray this one. It comes with a nice paint scheme, but since it was an unlettered locomotive, it needed to have an overspray. Plus I wanted to paint it a lighter gray so that the details would show up better, and just to show you how that works. Now in the later demonstration I'm going to show using the microscale masking material, but for now I just use some Woodland Scenics mold making material. This is liquid latex. I had some, I've used it before, and just I'm applying it with a very small piece of wood. Actually I'm using a little old throwaway paintbrush here. Just covering over things like the number board. We're going to cover over the headlight lens, the builder's plates, the bell, things that we don't want to have the color change on. Just work very carefully, and after we spray this, we'll be able to come back and just remove these parts easily, and we don't have to worry about cleaning up or removing paint that's been accidentally sprayed on. So it's just a masking material. And again, you can see my busted up left hand there. Injured it just as I started filming this whole video. I found it very frustrating, but was able to continue to go ahead and do it anyway. I just can't pick up anything heavy. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking the cab of the locomotive and actually stuffing Kleenex into it. The cab of the locomotive doesn't need to be repainted. It's a very nice green, which is a prototypical color. And we're not going to do anything really with the interior of the cab here. So what we're going to do is we're just filling it up. We want to, there's certain parts we don't want to have the paint get on. Now you can remove the trucks if you want to remove the trucks and drop them down, or you can just go ahead and take small pieces of paper and put them over the trucks like I'm doing here, and then tape them to the surface that your locomotive is going to be on while you're applying the paint. And you can use scissors and paper and just cut around and cover any of the parts that you don't want to have the paint get on. I don't want the paint to get onto the operating mechanism, the pistons and the rods and such on the side of this locomotive. So I'm covering up those portions too. And just think about what you need to cover and make sure you get it all covered. We're going to apply the paint pretty liberally. You want to cover up things like what I'm doing here is I'm reaching back under the rear end of this locomotive and sliding this paper up under in such a way as to cover the coupler first. Here I'm using Kleenex. Wanted to cover up the coupler so that I didn't get fresh paint on it. And the paints I'm going to do a little thing here, and what I did here is I put a little rust color along here. I didn't go ahead and remove the rust later in a weathering step, but you paint a little rust on here like this, let it dry, dab on some rubber cement, then go ahead and spray your locomotive. Then after your locomotive is sprayed, you can come back and remove the rubber cement by pressing on it with a piece of masking tape. And here I'm painting my locomotive. I use spray cans. In the next demonstration following this one, I'll show a light use of an airbrush. But I find Krylon dark gray paints work very well. And the secret in spraying a locomotive is not to try to cover it all in one swipe, but just to give it several very light coats from a distance and letting it set up. And that's what we have here. Now here it's dry, so we're starting to remove some of the stuff, and starting with the Kleenex that was in the cab. And if we're very careful in our masking and putting this stuff in, then everything, you can see there that everything's fine in there. No paint got into there. Want to be careful when removing the paper and everything. It might stick a little bit in certain spots, but by putting it in there carefully and removing it carefully, you save an awful lot of time. Okay, go through a lot of paper doing that, and of course we want to, you can see there that the electronics down in there, no paints on them. So it looks pretty good. I'm certainly satisfied with that paint job. So we want to remove the Kleenex from over the ends of the couplers, of course. And we want to carefully just work our way around and remove all the other paper. Now, the piece of paper I have right there I'm removing, I slid that up over the rear of the truck so that no paint would get on the trucks. Of course, this leaves your trucks the original color, but we're going to take care of that, and we're going to paint those by hand. So here's where we put the latex on the front of the number plate. And being careful, you can lift it off this way. A better way usually is just take some masking tape and roll up the masking tape and do that. So you can see there that left the number plate. The number looks pretty new. Now what I'm doing here is I'm spraying some of the paint. I'm showing you how to decant it into a container. Now when you do this, I use a clear cup here so that you can see what I'm doing, and I use a little disposable clear cup to do this. When you do this, don't do this using lightweight plastic. Actually use cans to do it, metal cans, because this paint will actually attack the plastic. So I've sprayed it in there. It's very thin. I've sprayed it into that little cup, and I've got a small paintbrush, and I'm just carefully going around painting all the parts that didn't get a spray paint that I want to have painted. So just working carefully around the trucks, you can apply the paint very carefully. You don't want to get it on any of the moving parts if you can avoid it. See that that shaft rotates there on this shay, so I'm being careful not to get any paint onto the rotating parts itself. Paint, even very small amounts of paint, can very easily keep one of these locomotives from running. Doesn't take much paint at all to gum up the works on one. So just being careful to go around and paint all the different parts. And again, this is that same color that we spray painted the boiler with. And along on the shafts and everything, paint them, but bear in mind that you don't want to paint any of the areas where the pieces actually are moving against each other, as it might gum up the works. So we're just carefully going along and painting there. And you can see the steam engine itself, the cylinders, got a little bit of paint at the top, but nothing else. Now we're not going to paint any of those bright, shiny parts. We're going to come back with Lube and go over those bright, shiny parts. So we're just painting most of the steam engine itself there. Just being very careful, just only painting the easy to get to parts. Now here, where the whistle is, that's brass. I'm actually taking a little bit of Tester's thinner. You can use Tester's liquid cement, but use Tester's thinner while this is still relatively fresh paint, and it'll very easily come off. You can see that it doesn't take long to get that off so that that brass color shows through. Now inside where the cab is, this is the only detail work we're going to do at the cab at all. I'm just reaching in there, and where the areas where the fireman and the engineer would stand and work, those areas wear through pretty quickly. So I painted a gray color in there, and coming back and just adding a little bit of rust with a lot of thinner. Can you see there's a lot of thinner there? Well, what we're trying to do is we don't want to paint this an actual rust color. We just want to give the impression of the metal wearing through and rust beginning to develop and to be deposited on the metal there. Of course, you can see from the side into the cab, so we're doing the same thing. We're just putting some gray on there, some very light gray, putting a little bit of rust, not a lot of rust, just a little bit. We want this locomotive to look like it's been well used, that it's been out in the woods for a long time and had a lot of hard use. Now things like the step, we want to go ahead and just apply a little paint there, lighten up the handrails a little bit more. Using some of the gray, you can use silver. Again, there's just a little tiny rust. See, we want just little bits of rust there. So much of what looks nice, ultimately, when something is weathered, is the very small amounts of paint and the small amounts of variation in color that you have. Now, what I use is this is Tester's thinner, and this is some Tester's rust, and into the cap of the Tester's roof brown. I'm mixing these together to get the kind of rust color that I look. You'll get rust, the fresh rust is like this color, the darker rust is older rust, but different metals and materials rust differently. So here I put just a tiny drop of this mixture on the top of the roof. Then I went back and added more thinner to the mixture. I add thinner in my brush to start with. Here what I wanted to do is I want to give this whole locomotive this slightly brown look. Now, if you live in an area where dirt and everything is gray, you're going to want to continue using a mottled gray look like we did in the last locomotive demonstration on disc 1. But here I wanted to have this reddish brown look that you would get if this locomotive were running in areas of Arizona or Colorado where there's a lot of red dirt, different areas where you would get this effect. And of course you could always, this could be just a little hint of rust showing through as well. But we're just changing the overall color of this locomotive. You can do this with grays, you can do this with a light tan, or in the case I've done here, I'm getting a sort of a roof brown color to the whole thing. Now when you apply these really thin down paints, if it pools up, just use a Kleenex or something to lift off and go back and do it again a little more lightly. Now by having this hatch on this roof actually be a little bit different color than the roof itself, it really helps details like this to stand out. You don't want them to be a lot different, but you want it to be just a little bit different. And we're going to work on those little differences when we do the paint the piping and things on this locomotive. Want to take our time doing this, of course. And as we brush down, when you're doing areas where it looks like there may have been water has rushed some of the dirt and other colors off, you like to paint downward with it so that it looks like it's coming off the roof like that. And just continue, if you see any areas that need touch up or the pooling up funny, change it. Now here you can see the roof is dry, and you can see what the finished color is once it's dry. When it's wet it looks a lot more yellow, but here it doesn't look nearly as yellow. But we want this rusty look all over our locomotive. Here I'm applying it to the sides of the tender, up on the top of the tender, around the inside of the tender. Just very small amounts of paint. Of course the area up around where the water would spill out, and collect will be more rusty than will be, say, the sides of the locomotive, of course. It's a nice little area back here when you're done with your locomotive. You can put tools back here, a chunk of chain or something like that. We're going to put a wood load on this locomotive. These locomotives come with a nice stack of wood. They also come with, in case it's an oil burning locomotive, a real nice oil assembly for back there. But I like to add my own particular wood rather than using theirs, so we'll do that. So here I'm just carefully going around on the inside of the tender, any place that is painted, just to put light amounts of this color on here. So we're going to, this dark gray locomotive is actually going to end up looking pretty brown all over by the time we're done. Now again, this is because of the kind of soil in the area that it works in. If they were working in the redwoods, if this locomotive were working in the redwoods, so much of the sawdust and decayed wood and everything has that red look to it. So this is the type dirt and grime that would build up on a locomotive that ran in the redwoods. They actually logged the redwoods a long time ago. There's still areas where there's small redwoods that can be harvested. But I grew up at the base of the sequoias in California. So on those summer days when it'd be 110, 115, as soon as I was able to, I'd drive up into the mountains quite often in the afternoon and go look at the redwoods. So I spent a lot of time looking at those redwoods. And there used to be a lot of logging activity up there a long, long time ago. So we're just continuing to work here and add small amounts of this really thinned down color. So we're not really trying to paint it brown. We just want it to be a nice thin overcoat, just so that it's something other than that jet black. And even as you look, when you look at the front of the boiler on this locomotive, this light gray, the details just stand out so much better. So much better with this light gray color. That's why I like to use it on my locomotives. Virtually all of my locomotives I paint this shade of gray. I don't put all covered with rust on it, but I do make it a shaded gray color rather than jet black, just so the details show up better. So I'm just continuing to add light amounts of this this stain as I go around. Want to do the whole thing. Want to work on top of the tea boiler, of course. Small amounts of paint. You let it dry, and after it's dry, you look at it and see whether it's too much or whether you want to add more. If you want to add more, it's very simple just to go ahead and go over it again. If you want to remove it, it's also very simple. Just give it a coat of Tester's thinner while the paints are fresh, and you can remove most of it. Of course, in extreme cases, if you wanted, you could always just paint the whole locomotive again, too. I have a friend, Mark Blair, who bought a West Side C25 back about 1975. And I swear he's painted that locomotive and taken the paint off and painted it again probably 10 times over the years. Just every once in a while he decides he wants to weather it again and do everything, so he starts all over. So that locomotive's had a lot of usage. When it comes to removing paint from a locomotive, cheap brake fluid is very effective. You want to experiment with it because I know on Atlas HO scale diesels, when they first started coming out, the plastic they used would be dissolved by brake fluid. You'd dunk it into the brake fluid and let it sit overnight, and instead of the paint falling off in the morning, you'd have a very soft locomotive shell, and when you went to pick it up, it would just twist and bend in your hands. So use discretion. There are brands of paint removers available. People use a lot of different things. I've always just used cheap brake fluid. Now, good quality brake fluid won't do it. It's treated, so it won't do it. It's got to be cheap brake fluid. So we're just continuing here on this locomotive, applying small amounts. We're pretty much working from the top down, doing the upper extended things like the top of the T-boiler, then the sand dome, the headlight, areas like that. Starting at the top and working our way down. Again, just putting a light coat on. And if you get to where you think there's too much, then just remove some of it, like the paint there on the top of the sand dome. That's still fresh, so as the paint pools there and collects there, I can go back with a dry brush like this and just pick that up. See how easily that comes off? And just use it on the rest of the locomotive. You can do that any place along as you do this. Again, we're not trying to paint this brown. We just want it to have an overall brown hue to it. The other locomotive that I painted years ago, I use this technique. I want both locomotives to be operating on the same lumber company, so I need both of them to be weathered approximately the same. Now, I use a lot of testers paints. They're commonly available. You can buy them in very small quantities, so that what I do almost always when I go to start a new project, I always go down and buy new paint. No matter what size bottle of paint I use, it seems like I never use it up. I do a lot of staining and using very small amounts of paint. So like this little bottle of paint here, if I kept the same bottle, it would last me essentially forever. But I learned long ago, at least for me, not to skimp on the paint. I can afford to spend $10 on paint when I go to paint a new model. So on something like this, a locomotive like this I'm going to have forever, well, I don't mind spending that $10 on it. Now, the areas along here, these are made different things I'm pointing out here. One, on the lettering back there, that's pretty fresh lettering. I like it to look a little older, so I'm taking just the edge of an X-Acto knife, and I'm just scraping that. And when I scrape it, I pretty much scrape it straight up and down. I may break it up a little bit, but pretty much straight up and down, because I want it to look like as it weathered, that the paint and everything just went straight down. Have to be, now I use dry transfers here. I use a lot of decals, but I prefer dry transfers for my locomotives whenever possible. Here I'm touching just a little bit of, you can do this two ways. You can use a little bit of white, very thin amount, that's what I'm doing here, or you can actually use a little bit of Tester's liquid cement and apply it to the dry transfers, and you can do it to a degree with decals. It'll actually cause that paint to dissolve a bit. Now this is pretty extreme. This is poor quality paint that they put on here, obviously, because it doesn't stick worth beans. So you may not want to do that much. You may want to have it less weathered than that. Now if you get too much on, you can use your finger to wipe it down a little bit like that, or you can just use a little bit of thinner. So here I'm just, now this is very thin paint. I'm being very careful and very gentle to apply just a little tiny bit. Don't want to put much paint on here. Again, you can use acrylics. Acrylics are popular. You can use Floquil. There's lots of different brands of paint today. We're very fortunate there's much to choose from. But here in Alaska, my local hobby shop doesn't stock very many different kinds of paints. I had a hobby shop in California back in early 70s, and then a train shop here in Anchorage in the late 70s. And the one thing I did, I stocked essentially every kind of paint there was, because I like to use a variety of different paints in my modeling. I don't use a lot of Floquil. Never have. It's a very popular paint, a very good paint, but I've never cared that much for it. I really preferred Pactra paints, but Testers bought those out about 20 years ago and discontinued some of my favorite colors. But these little bottles of Tester I find are very easy to work with. So again here I'm just roughing this up with the tip of my X-Acto knife. Now this is Tester's Flat Interior Tan. And what it is I'm going to paint the wooden running boards on the locomotive with this very tan color. As you can see, I'm putting it on there. It's a very thin coat, but I'm really trying to cover it completely. And as I brush in the direction of the grain. That way, if there's any parts that don't have even coverage, it looks okay. So again, this very tan color I'm painting on here, and I'm just covering the wooden parts. On the locomotive, the running boards are wood. The end beams are wood. Back when Ephraim Shea first started making Sheas, his whole underframe was made out of wood. At least that's what I've been led to believe. I don't know if that's true or not. So here I'm going over, this time I've added a little bit of a gray to it. Now here I'm going back, left it time to set there, and I'm going and just brushing across the top with a dry brush I put some thinner on there, and I'm going across with a dry brush and lifting up the paint from off the top. What this does, this leaves a lot of that original black or that original gray there, but it leaves it so that you can, I don't know if how this is going to show up on your TV, but it allows the grain to actually show through by doing it this way. Again, we don't want it to be a solid tan, fresh wood color, but we do want a variety of colors there. You know, when you look at painting wood or painting metal or plastic to look like wood takes quite a bit of practice. I find a combination of the Tester's Gunship Gray, this International Tan, and some of the Roof Brown applied carefully is the best way I've found for making it look like wood. And we want to recognize, again, we want to define those boards there. And what I'm doing here, just going along, just adding just a little bit. You just have to work back and forth on this till it looks about right to you, and then you stop. Okay, so now we're going to switch, and we're going to be working on the end beams for the locomotive frame. And these pieces are made from wood, so we're going to do our best to go ahead and make this. By the time we're all done, hopefully these pieces are going to look like they're made from wood. If you prefer to use water-based paints instead of enamels, I recommend that you do this step using Dr. Ben's driftwood stain. Apply it over the metal or the wooden parts, the things that are supposed to look like they're wood, actually metal or plastic. Apply that over, let that dry, then use some of his other colors. That's probably too much for me to explain to you while I'm working on doing this, or I'll get behind here. So let me concentrate on this. When you look at the model, you have to determine what parts are made from wood and which parts are metals. Now the metal straps that hang down that support these foot plates, they're made from metal, but the foot plate itself is made from wood. The coupler box that we see there, that's made from metal, so we don't want to paint that part. When we're doing this, we only want to paint those parts that we know are actually wood. Apply small amounts of paint, working at it very carefully. Anytime that goes on you don't like the way it looks, you can just add some thinner and pick it up. So I'm just taking it off because I don't want it to be completely tan. If I wanted it to be completely tan, I would just paint it full strength. Okay, so here you can see I work on a little piece of plastic. Actually, this is plastic that I painted black. When I film these videos, if I do it and use white plastic, it looks fine to me, but then when it shows up on the screen, the colors are off because the camera automatically compensates for different color intensity and brightness. So if you've got a lot of bright white, it really changes the colors here. So we did the front beam, and now we're just working along on the back beam, getting all these little areas to get this basic wood color, this very light color tan. And as we weather later, we'll be changing the color, but we're getting this on and letting it have a chance to really set up and to dry well before we do the next step. Again, we're just doing the parts that on the real locomotive we know would be wood. That's all we're doing here, being very careful. As I work along, you may think that some of these sequences I'm spending too much time on. But I have to approach this from the viewpoint of somebody who's never done this before. So some of these sequences are a little long. Now, the paint that I hand painted on here for the cylinders on the side of the locomotive, that paint is completely dry. So I'm coming back with some rust color. Now, there's more rust color here than there is on the boiler. If you look at the boiler behind it, you'll see the rust colors are not this intense. Here, on the cylinders and in this area here, these are the areas that would rust up pretty quickly because of the huge amount of water that escapes from the steam and from the amount of the steam. And these areas get quite a bit of wear. They're moving parts, therefore the paint tends to chip off a little more quickly. So I want those to be a little more rusty than the rest. And along on the whole bottom side, we want to start highlighting this to bring it out. This paint that we painted at this very light color that we started with is now set up completely. If you don't let it set up completely, when you go over with these thin washes with the thinner in it, then it will just dissolve that early coat of paint and lift it up and blend the colors together. Something you want to avoid doing. So we're just continuing along, adding little bits of this rust colored paint here. Just putting highlights, and again, when this dries, most of this color is going to disappear. But the whole underside of the locomotive needs to be more rusty than the upper parts. That's the part really gets the abuse from hitting weeds, if there's a limb that brushes against it, just all kinds of different things cause these pieces to wear and rust out a little bit more. And again, we want to make sure that we don't get any paint into the moving parts, because we don't want to affect the ability of this to actually run. So if you get a little in there, add a little thinner, put a dry brush in there, and it'll suck that right out. Okay, now you notice we're not painting these a solid rust color. We're just letting little highlights show up here and there. Subtlety in your weathering is very important. It's also a good shot of the boiler here, that you can see that the boiler is a grayish brown color. Now, working at the back of the locomotive, we're going to do exactly the same thing. The paint here again is completely dry, and we're just brushing on light amounts of rust. Now, the rust that I use here, this is the Tester's Roof Brown. I like this reddish rust. This is where I live. For some reason we get a lot more of this reddish rust, and I don't know whether that's the climate. I'm sure it's the material that's corroding, how long the rust has been there, how quickly it builds up. Rust is really a problem up here in Alaska. Our roads are solid ice for at least half the year, so we go through a lot of rock salt. So when I see things here that are made from metal, they corrode very quickly, whereas in the deserts of California they do not. Okay, we're working on the other side. Again, just going through and applying this rust. It's a little heavier than the brown upper color. Again, if you look at that locomotive that's painted dark gray that has that light coat of rust on it, that rust, all it does is give it sort of a brownish hue. It's not really a brown locomotive per se. Just go along, just hitting different areas. Back in here at the bottom part of the boiler, we want to recognize and remember that's where the motor for this locomotive is. So we don't want to get anything on the bottom of it or anything that might interfere with it, but just the areas that are easy to reach and easy to get to. Again, you'll notice I'm just using the cap of the paint container to hold the paint and working from it, dipping into the thinner, going and picking up a little bit of paint directly to the locomotive. One reason I like to keep things light is in our layout rooms, they're always so dark. One thing I've noticed over the years, a lot of people will paint buildings and locomotives, things like that. They're a natural looking color as they using paint that is matched very carefully. But when we look at those things in real life, it's always out in the sunshine. So the sunshine always produces a different effect. We need to keep it light. Now here I'm using some Tester's Flat Enamel Gray. That coat of International Tan that I put on the running boards, that's set up now and that's dry. So now I'm coming back with the tan, and I'm just going to be adding little highlights here and there. Now I have thinner mixed with this color to start with, and I'm just putting small amounts on, working it around, trying to get just sort of a old weathered gray look. When you look at this and you see the colors here in this video, this is not like it looks like in your train room. What happens when I make one of these videos, the lights that I have affects it quite a bit, the color. If you look at that pipe that's running right along in front of the area or over the area where I'm working, see it's got sort of a bluish tint, where it's really a pale gray, but that bluish tint comes from the lighting where I'm doing my filmmaking. Okay, so there we worked on that and we got that pretty well straightened away to the point that we want it done. And then we need to continue doing it on the other running board, of course, and on the front and rear pilot beam as well. Now when I pick this paint up, one thing I do is I dab it on the surface there. It gets rid of most of the paint, so we're doing sort of a dry brushing type effect. Now when we get to to the metal parts on the end. This area around where the coupler pocket is, this would get a lot of abuse in real life. This would get a lot of wear. So we want to make sure that we definitely rust it. Now we're adding this rust to simulate the rust, of course, but also to add a little color to your locomotive. As you're looking at your locomotive, if you can find little parts or pieces to detail, to add a little color or variation to it, it's always nice. One thing that's nice on a locomotive like this Shay that you can do is you can take the running boards, and on the running boards you can build a toolbox or just a box and have it on each side and put different little details that you've weathered. A chain, some tools, maybe a block of wood or two, different things that could be used to help re-rail a log car, or possibly to even re-rail the locomotive itself. Just different things that you might need when you're actually working out in the woods and you didn't want to have to make a long, slow trip back to the engine house or to the sawmill to pick up something. Things like that always add a little bit of detail. In reality, they didn't do an awful lot of that, but it looks nice on a model. One thing, often a locomotive would get water from a standard water tank, of course, but sometimes when it was out in the woods, it was easier just to take a hose and put it into a nearby stream and pump the water up into the locomotive water tank in order to have water for the return trip. So that hose is something that could realistically easily be added and just hung like on the front over the your smokestack or your headlight and hanging down, so it was easy to get to. Now on the different pipes here, what I'm doing is I'm just going along and I'm putting different shades of rust, different intensities of rust, and actually different colors of rust. See, that pipe that runs along there stands out so much better if it's a little different color than the boiler. And even that sand pipe that comes down there, making it a different color will help it to stand out. If you don't want to use the rust, use a lighter shade of gray or a darker shade of gray to make it stand out. In any place where there's fittings or anything like that, of course, a little extra rust never hurts right in those areas because there would be most likely water in use there, so things would get used quite a bit. Okay, just working very carefully, and you know, when you get a little bit of rust color like around where that fitting is there, it doesn't hurt to have that. On the back where they keep the sand, those would get used quite a bit, and it would be a fitting area to have a little more rust. The handrail at the back, you don't want to make it solid red. You don't want to paint any of these things as solid brown. You're just wanting to add highlights to it to help bring out the details in the locomotive itself. A little bit of rust flowed onto the coupler pocket back here, just like we did at the front. Need to add a little bit of color again to the straps, to the coupler box. Again, you're not trying to change the color drastically, and when you put the paint around the coupler itself, you want to make sure that you don't cause the coupler itself to get frozen into position. Being very discreet about doing this. You get up along near the boiler. Shows a good photo of the color of the boiler. This dark gray shows up very nicely, and the light brown over the boiler is not bad. Now here I've painted that hose, that pipe, a different shade of brown so it'll stand out. You can paint it gray, of course. You can, lots of different colors it can be painted. But what we're trying to do is Since we buy these locomotives with all these beautiful details on them, we're just trying to make sure that you can actually see them. And Bachmann locomotives certainly are well detailed. Back when I first started buying brass, it wasn't any more detailed than this, and actually probably not as well detailed as this. And these are wonderful bargains. Bachmann has really changed over the years, and I really look to them as being the standard that I like to go by, certainly as far as steam locomotives go. If it's a steam locomotive I actually want to operate and run, then I want to make sure that it's a Bachmann. Just adding little bits of color here and there. Back behind the running boards there, and the part of the frame would show a little bit of rust on it. Don't want to neglect any of those different areas. Again, just very small amounts of paint. Any place you see where a little bit of color would make it nice. Along here on the tender, what I'm doing is very thin paint, as you can tell. I'm not wanting to really glob a lot of things here, but I do want to tone down my lettering that I put on there for PMR. I want to tone it down a bit. So just putting a light wash on it. Same thing on the other side. Notice I always start at the top and work my way down. This one allows the paint to sort of flow down like it would in real life. We should always approach our weathering and think of it in terms of how things would weather in reality. And always very light coats. We can always come back tomorrow and add some more. But if you get a lot on there to start with, it's pretty hard to get it all off. Areas like these handles, those might be brass in real life, I don't know. But here we're just adding a little extra rust to them to bring them out. And on the top of the lid, for where the water is put in, certainly a little more rusty. So this is how our locomotive is looking. It's looking pretty good. And you may just want to stop at this point right here. That's your choice. When weathering, we always want to make sure that we stop rather than getting carried away. But I want to put some powders on here to add dirt to it and also to add soot. And these kind of powders, you can get these from Bragdon Enterprises. You can get them from Dr. Ben. There's probably other companies well. Or you can actually just experiment with raw paint pigments if you have a source for paint pigments. But these little things here are from Joel Bragdon. I bought these years ago. I got a total of 8 of these. It just cost me a few dollars. And you can see, although I've had them a few years, you can hardly tell there's any been used at all. So I see Joel at different conventions pretty often. It's always easy for me to pick up a little bit more. And the ones you get from Dr. Ben are huge. Again, they're very reasonably priced. But each container of, like the black that I'm working with here, his container is probably 10 times as big as this for not much more at all. So Dr. Ben's is really an excellent buy if you're going to use this a lot, especially. What I'm doing here is I'm taking, even though our locomotive is a dark gray, I'm taking some of this black powder and rubbing it around the spark arrestor on the top, on the stack, and where soot and carbon would deposit on the top of the locomotive. In real life, when you look at this particular locomotive, my finished model, this really adds an awful lot to it, this change in the color of paint right around there. And of course, if there's any parts of your locomotive that you think you got too brown or you want to darken up, you can just rub some of this in. Now, this particular type of powders, both those from Bragdon Enterprises and from Dr. Ben, do not need a fixative spray to hold them in place. If you use rather usual artist pastels, then and you use them, then you'll want to put an overcoat of spray to hold them in place, because otherwise they'll rub off quite easily. But these from Bragdon and from Dr. Ben don't rub off. They just they stay in place. And of course, you don't want to handle your locomotive much with oily fingers when you've used powders on there. But just normal use, they'll work fine. And I'm just going around now, like here on the top of the roof. I figured that a lot of dust and soot would get deposited here, so I'm rubbing some in here as well. And we want some variety of color. And just work them in. Apply different amounts in different areas and work them in. You can apply several colors at once. Again, when doing this, you'll notice I've got a newspaper spread out because I sure get a lot of dust everywhere. And I just pick up some of the dust that's on the paper and just add it to the floorboard. And you can see that floorboard is looking a lot different than it did when I first painted it that international tan. See, it's got it looks different than the rest of the locomotive because it's from wood, but the colors are just pretty dirty and dingy. Now, around the engine, the actual steam engine itself, these powders are good to put on, because if any of this gets into, as long as this is dry while you're doing this, and this is dry, I guess I should point it out, I let this paint job dry thoroughly before applying the powders. You can go around, and if some of it gets on the parts that actually move, that's okay. It'll soon wear off, and it won't hurt any of it. So I'm just dirtying up the different areas here. Just these powders are really handy. If you use ordinary artist pastels, like you get at Michael's, and you give it an overspraying, one thing about Tester's dull coat, when you spray it on, it causes most of the appearance of the powders to disappear. I'm not quite sure why it does that, but it does it, so keep that in mind. Tester's now has another type of overspray, a fixative, that does not cause the chalks to disappear. Krylon in at Walmart or at Home Depot or Lowe's, you can buy Krylon. They have a clear fixative in a large can that goes a long way. And again, with it, it doesn't cause the powders to disappear much. So we're just working these powders on all the different parts of the locomotive where we want to have a dusty effect to it. And you see the difference there between the side where I haven't put any powders on and where I have. So we just take a moment and apply some more powders along there. Really rub the stuff in. Now, that brush I have is not a soft brush. That's a very stiff bristle. When you buy brushes, if you buy your brushes at Michael's, you can get a lot of these little stiff white bristle brushes for a very low price. And I keep one or two that I use just for this. I don't clean this up and then use it for painting later. I just use it over and over for doing the same thing. I have a lifetime supply of brushes. Most people in the hobby end up buying a whole bunch of locomotives. I never have. I've never gone overboard on locomotives. But I did buy quite a few for this demonstration here. 3 of the 4 that we're working on are Bachmann. Started off with one from IHC. I got it at a very good price, and it was different, so I wanted to just try it with, and demonstrate using a different brand of locomotive. But the Bachmann's is what I really recommend. If Bachmann makes a locomotive that fits into your scheme of things, then I highly recommend going with the Bachmann. Of course, if you're working in ON30, there's lots of other companies making really good quality ones. MMI, a division of Precision Scale, makes good ON30 locomotives, and BLI make both ON30 and HO standard gauge models exceptionally good quality models. You know, the quality of our steam locomotives has changed so much in recent years. It's just amazing how many more we have to choose from, and how so many of them are really, really good. Now here I'm putting this dust on the tinder, and as I look at the tinder now that it's all finished and I've finished this video and everything, I realize that's a little more dusty than I would really like for it to be. So what I would do, if you get an area that's too brown like that, just go over it again with the black powder and just tone it down and add more black to it, and it works very well for hiding the other powder. So here now you'll notice I use a variety of powders here. I don't want any of these things to be exactly the same size or the same shade. I like to use a lot of variety in the colors. And whether you're using sprays, whether you're using powders, whether you're using brushed on enamels, no matter what you're doing, when you're done with any locomotive, of course you want to clean the wheels very carefully. And again, what I use is just a little bottle of Testors liquid cement, a small amount applied. In an earlier demonstration I tried to show how you could do it so that you got the wheels spinning and as you cleaned it as it went. That's one way of doing it, but if you're just doing an occasional locomotive like I do, then it's fine just to turn your locomotive over and using a brush and some of the plastic cement, just clean the wheels that you can reach easily, then set it on the track and apply power and let it turn a little bit, and then clean the other parts of the wheels. You don't really have to get them spinning all the time to do it. It was just something I wanted to show. Something I really don't normally do, but truthfully, a lot of times what I'll actually do with the locomotive. Oh, let me stop and talk about Neolube. We've talked about Neolube before. Now you get Neolube. I got this from PBL Locomotive Works. I got this probably 20 years ago, and I've got enough in this bottle. It's going to last me the rest of my life with no problem at all. And the Neolube, we're just going over the shiny metal parts and anything that needs lubrication. It'll be a little different color, but over time the color will change a little bit, and as natural dust deposits on it, it'll change. But this keeps it running very, very nicely. It's very good and effective. Again, you can get it from PBL, or you can go online and just do a Google search for Neolube and get it there. This is one of the finishing touches on this locomotive. I'm not going to give it an overspray with a fixative or to apply dust or anything like that. Just doing it all with a brush and using the powders. Now again, the locomotive started off jet black, and I painted it with a dark gray color so that the details would stand out a lot better. And this is really my preferred way. This particular demonstration, when I weather locomotives for myself, this is how I do it. And there's your finished locomotive. A little table like that makes it easy. We need to put a load on there, of course, but a little round table like this when you're weathering is very nice, and of course it comes in handy here. So you can see the one closest to us right now, that was my old Shay. And here's the one that I just weathered to give it a family resemblance. Very similar. Now this is how your locomotive would look in a layout environment. Here's a close-up. So let's go on to our next model. When I got my Bachmann HO scale 460, I was amazed at how well detailed it was. just looks every bit as good as any brass locomotive that I ever had. Now, it was unlettered, so I put my road name on the tender, PMR, and there were several different cabs that came with it. So one of the cabs I put a number 12 on, but then I really didn't like the lettering, so at some point you'll see that there's a change. But this is a beautifully detailed little locomotive. Now, microscale micro mask is a masking fluid that you can use to paint on areas such as the windows or the headlight, any place where you don't want paint to be applied. Now, we're going to give this locomotive an overspray at the end with an airbrush of Floquil Earth. Just a very light dusting, but I wanted to make sure none of it got up onto the windows, onto the headlight, or pieces like that. So using a very small brush, you'll need to throw this brush away when you're done, but using a very small brush, take the micro mask and just apply it to the windows, to the builder's plates, to the front of the headlight, just any place where you want it to be the color that the locomotive originally came as being. Work very carefully here. Now, here is the locomotive that we painted earlier in the second demonstration. You can see how clear the details stand out, whereas the details don't stand out on this 460 at all. We know they're there, but they don't stand out. That's why I like to use those lighter colors, but most people don't like it that light. So instead of giving this an overspray and instead of toning it down, we're going to work with it and leave it the basic black, but we are going to weather it. Now, these are artist pastels. You can buy these at Michael's. A set like this, it's probably $10, maybe $15 these days. I paid about $3 for it 20, 30 years ago, and I've still got most of it left. You take the black, for example. We're just going to use a few of the earth colors here. And then using an emery board, you can use a sandpaper. There's different ways, or you can use a file, a rasp. I just find I have a lot of emery boards. I keep them around. It's very convenient. And I'm putting this onto a piece of paper. And before long, you got enough to do a locomotive with no problem at all. That's more than enough for this whole demonstration. Then put it in a little disposable cup. And we want to go ahead and we want to do this not only for this particular shade, but we want to do it for several different ones. Now, here's a darker brown that be nice at times for blending. And when you work with these colors, you don't have to use just one color. You can blend them together. Now, when you put these type of colors on a locomotive, when you're done, you always have to give it an overspray of a fixative. And as I mentioned earlier, dull coat will actually make most of this disappear. So it's not the best one. Testers does have a new matte overspray that doesn't cause them to disappear nearly as much. And then Krylon has an overspray. Now, the references I've been using throughout this video are from this book put out by BHI Publications. This is just filled with, I just don't know, each page has so many photos on it. Just all kinds of interesting things in here. Just excellent for ideas on what to weather, why to weather it. So I've used this for references for myself as I've gone through here. Like here on the back head, look at this beautiful photo of this back head. You can see that it's different colors of gray. There's some rust areas, some light colors. Right around the smoke box doors is much lighter. See how much lighter that is? And we know that back in there there's a lot of heat. So these paints are really affected by the heat. Look at the floor of the cab. Think about how how you would model it. Just think about those different colors. Now on this one, I remove the cab, and we're actually going to work a little bit on the back end here. And we're using some of the powdered pigments I've talked about before. Plus we're going to use some dry pigments. These are actual color pigments from Gamblin. I get these online through dickblick.com, artist supplier. And it's a deep red, and I thought that deep red really looked a lot like the way the color would look on the firebox. Now this is really rough here. Now I'm only putting this on the firebox itself. We know that there's a certain line where the cab starts, so we're just doing it right here on the smoke box. I'm putting it on heavy. I'm starting with very light color, obviously, because we want to lighten the color up. Want to lighten it up. And we just start rubbing it wherever we want it to stay. Now this does not stick like the Bragdon's and the Dr. Ben's chalks. I'm not going to put an overspray on it here because it's inside the cab and it's never going to be touched. And it's a shame to have to cover up cab detail like this when the manufacturer has done well. Now for HO scale this is fine. The O scale models that I've worked with, the cab details is much better than this, but this is good representation of an interior of a cab, and you just see it a little bit as you look through the windows or behind the cab and look inside. We're going to make them lighter than usual because since it's in the dark part of the cab, it's hard to see it at all, and if you make it dark nobody will ever see it. So we're just going to put those colors on like that, rub them in, and just think about areas where the fireman might step. So I'm going to hold this little plate up here that bridges between the cab and the tender, and I'm going to apply the same type of weathering on it with these chalks. And then when I'm all done, I'll use my can of compressed air, or I could use a compressor and blow off all the excess. A lot of it will still stay, and enough of it will still stay to accomplish what we want it to do. Now we're not going nuts on doing the details on this cab, just a little bit. Just working on different areas according to how it looked in that photo. Now on the locomotive itself, we're going to lightly weather this locomotive. We're going to do it actually in two stages. We're going to lightly weather the whole thing, and then at the end I'm actually going to give it a pretty heavy overspray. But at that point we'll talk about the precautions you need to make. So we want this one to be pretty much a brand new passenger locomotive, but it still has a certain amount of wear on it. So I'm just taking flat black Tester's paint and just lightly brushing it onto the smokestack here. Not trying to paint it solid black, just putting small amounts. Can you see how small that brush is? That's only 1 or 2 strands of camel hair that's on there. Very, very small. Very light amounts, and we want to try to go up and down with it as much as we can. Well, let me bring it over so you can see what I'm doing. There we go. Want to work primarily up and down as best you can. I've gotten old and shaky, so I can no longer paint nice straight lines like I used to be able to do. But you get the idea here. And we just want very small amounts of paint. Just let it streak down a little bit like that, like it accumulated. Of course, up on top of the stack, we want that to be just jet black or a very dark gray, because that's where a lot of the soot would be, of course, is right coming out of that stack all the time. Want to take your time doing this. You have to realize that locomotives are an expensive investment. You're going to have it for a very long time. So you want to try your best to do a good job and not be in a big hurry. But try to come up with as many and cover as many of the details as you can in order to bring them out. But on this one, we're not going heavily overboard. Here we're just putting soot, carbon, mainly on the rear part behind the stack. As the locomotive normally moves forward, the stuff that deposits lands towards the back, and just the wind itself will move those fresh deposits of ashes from right around the stack to further back on the boiler. Okay, and we want to put a little bit, not a lot, we're just putting a little bit. Now this is thinned down here. We're just putting little bits on the boiler. We're not wanting a lot here. We're just wanting it to have a stain, make it look like it's rained and it's washed some of this down. Again, a small amount. We're not getting real carried away on this locomotive at all. Very easily done, very carefully done. And then of course we want to do areas right behind the stack, again on this side, just like we did on the other side. Want to look at other parts of the locomotive where we think residue might appear. Now these are really nice detailed parts there. These little fine details sure make for this being a very nice locomotive. Now here on the running board, we're just going to put tiny little drops of paint. Now I have thinner in my brush, and then I go into the paint, and then I go back to the thinner, just like we did earlier. But here we're going to make a lighter application of it. We're only going to be putting this paint in little areas to sort of bring out the highlights on different parts, like those tubes there that run along this footplate or running board. When I add some there. And where the pipes run down, just highlighting them a little bit. Now these pipes right here were usually wrapped with asbestos to hold the heat in. So those pipes can either be white, which is the color of the asbestos, or after they were applied, they would often go ahead and paint it anyway. So white or black, or white and black. Just all we're doing is just adding a little bit of color to bring out the details. Now when this paint dries, it's going to be more subtle than what it looks like here. So we're just applying over, like on that generator back there, on the steam dome. Just small amounts, not getting carried away on this. We want it to have wear. If you don't want it to be worn, then don't weather it, or just paint it a little bit. And of course you got to keep in mind what I'm doing on these videos and what I'm doing in these demonstrations. I'm just showing you the methods and talking about why it would accumulate in certain areas and how the weathering would come about, just to help you learn how to do it. And when you do your own weathering, do it to the degree you want. None of these demonstrations here are really over-weathered, although there are a lot of people who would think it'd be over-weathered. You know, when these trains were running, this was an expensive investment by the owner of the railroad, a locomotive like this. And he would be proud of it, he would want it well maintained. And when railroads were young, locomotives were very carefully washed, very carefully painted, and very well maintained. But as time went on and the novelty of railroads passed, then they became more common and people didn't take care of them as much. If it were a passenger train, those were always very well maintained, so that passengers would feel that could see that it was a well maintained locomotive. But for the freight locomotives and the switchers, those very quickly got to the point where they weren't well maintained at all. And as you go through these reference photo books that are put out by BHI, you'll see, no matter how heavily I've weathered any one particular part of any one particular locomotive here, you're going to see examples in those books of how the locomotives in real life were weathered like that. By putting a light wash like on the front of this boiler, it just settles in and brings out details without really changing the color an awful lot. The handrails and things like that, anything like that needs to be brought out a bit. Looking at the other side of the locomotive, just want to continue adding highlights. Now these steps here where they step up to help put sand in the sand dome, those wear quite a bit. So I always want to have a little bit of wear showing on those areas of the locomotive. And of course, as we've done in earlier treatments, we want to put a little bit of stain on the steam dome, on the sand dome, on these different pipes. Again, we're not trying to put a lot on there, just a small amount. Highlighting, put a little bit of a stain to highlight. Now, these colors here, while they're wet, are pretty intense. But later when you look at this, you're going to see that these colors are not very intense at all. Just trying to bring out these details. I find by brushing this thin mix on, I get a better effect than if I use full strength. Just sort of the paint settles into the cracks and crevices on these details in such a way as to really make them pop out. And that's what I'm trying to do. I approach a lot of this. I do a lot of artwork. And as I paint, I recognize certain principles that are important of contrast, of use of negative space areas where there's no details, how just little highlights and subtle changes can really affect how something looks overall. So I bring a little bit of that into this part of the hobby as well. And I work with these paints, I've used these same kind of paints for so many years. I recognize pretty much how it's going to look when it's dry. And if any of these are too strong, if it's too gray, when you're done, well, you can just come right back over with some flat black paint and go over them, or you can use some of the powders, the black powders we've used before, to go over them. But right now we're just concentrating on putting a little highlight on these things, letting it flow on pretty naturally, just to sort of settle where it wants. Now you get down around the valve gear. This is beautiful valve gear on this locomotive, but we want to make sure we don't put anything on there that is going to affect the running of the locomotive. So we want to be very careful around where the main rod's attached to the drivers and the valve gear itself. Again, that Neo Lube that we've used before works very well for coloring and providing lubrication as well. So here I'm just picking up a little bit of the, moving the colors around a little bit, just working slowly, checking it all out as I turn it around. As these colors dry, you'll get a better feel for where you need to add some and where you need to take some away. A little blue tint you see on the headlight right there, that's some of the micro scale masking material on there. It's nice because it's blue instead of clear, so it's a reminder of where you have this when you're done. Sometimes when the paint dries, it leaves some odd looking areas like you have there. A lot of that will be taken care of in later weathering. The weathering is multi-steps. We don't just start and paint it one way and just stick with that. We paint it, add a layer of this, we come back with a layer of that, maybe another layer over that, and get an accumulative effect. Now here you can see this is a nice shot of the cab. You can see the different cab style on the windows and a different cab number that I put on here. Just wasn't satisfied with my original lettering job on the first cab, and the letters were a lot larger than I really wanted this one to look like. Now here you'll see that the paint is sort of beating up. It doesn't really flow well on there. One thing you can do with the model is take it, before you do anything, take a can of Tester's Dull Coat, give the whole thing an overspray. This will protect the decals or the lettering that it comes on, but it'll also give the surface a little bit of a tooth for these paints to stick to so that they go on. So consider giving it an overcoat of dull coat ahead of time, letting it dry thoroughly, and then coming ahead and doing these different things. Around the cab, we don't want to obscure the numbers on the side of the cab very much, because locomotive companies kept those pretty clean. We can think in terms of anything you want to add, like an armrest for the guy who works there leaning out the window. He'd sure like to have a nice armrest instead of that plate metal. Okay, here we're putting a little bit of stain. Again, this is not white. This is that light gray that we've been using. This is, it looks pretty white here, but that's more of a trick of the photography than it is the actual color. It's really that light gray that we've used throughout. And when we put it on, we just want it to sort of flow down like it would in real life. And where it pulls up along the bottom, just run your paintbrush along, and that'll absorb any excess paint that's down there. Again, thinking about the areas where they walk. Now here, this is Liquitex matte medium and gloss medium. I've mixed the two together there, and I'm taking, this is some alcohol. This is rubbing alcohol, and I'm taking this matte medium with this very soft brush, and I'm picking up just little bits and putting it into this alcohol. So I got 3. This will make 4 scoops. I'm not wanting very much of this matte medium here at all, just a little tiny bit. 5 scoops, and I call it matte medium, but it's actually a blend of the matte and the gloss, so it's a satin, a semi-gloss finish, which is what we're after. Now here, I take a clean brush, a small clean brush, dip it into the mix of the matte medium and into those powders that we ground up earlier. Different powders, and what we're doing here is we're just applying it in areas to represent rust. Rust, when you look at rust in real life, it's got a really powdery look to it, a rough surface. So using chalks does a fine job of representing that. Now this will be darker here by far while you see it here on the screen than it will be when it's finished. When you're finished and these have dried, this won't be quite as prominent. So here again, we're just always thinking about where rust or corrosion or dirt would gather. Here behind the steam chest, right by the valves, the exhaust, there'd be a leak there. That would get rusty. Again, just putting small amounts of this color in here. And what this matte medium blended with the gloss medium does, it actually binds this and sort of glues it. We use matte medium for glue for holding down our ballast on roadbeds a lot. So we're just using it as a very thin type of glue. Don't use Elmer's glue for this. Use matte medium mixed with gloss medium, and you get a semi-gloss effect when it's done. Now the colors are much more pronounced while they're wet than after this is set up. So that's something you just have to experiment a bit to see how long, and see for yourself how long the particular ingredients you are using take for it to dry completely and to set up, and how it's going to look after you're done with it. That's something that you just have to experiment a bit with these. If you got an old locomotive to play with, weather it first and then do your good ones. Now in areas like on the top of the tender, again, where water would spill over and where the fireman or the brakeman would be up there lifting these lids, these hatches, so the water could be added, that water would slip around and that worker would walk around on the surface and actually cause the paint to actually wear there, so there would be more rust there than usual. Now up in the area here, I just wanted to add a little more rust. A little bit more there. Okay, now you can see how that is. That may be more than you want. That's a personal taste. I sort of like letting colors like this flow into these cracks and crevices in order to bring out the colors. Now here again, our brush is wet with our medium, our semi-gloss medium, and I'm picking up some of the black powder and just putting it right on the top of the smokestack and right behind. Now the paint under here is completely dry, so what this will do is the alcohol will evaporate out of this very quickly. The matte medium itself and the gloss medium are white when they're wet, but when they dry clear. So any color you see from this glue that we're using is all going to disappear. It's not going to affect the final color of your locomotive at all. So areas up here on top would be places where there would be glue and such. And so we've used this, just think about different areas where you would want this type of finish to be. You can always go back and add more. You want to be careful around your cab and on your locomotive. You just want to paint it and evaluate it and really think about how it looks. Now here, earlier I talked about how this pipe would be wrapped with asbestos and sometimes be painted. So this was wrapped with asbestos on this locomotive, but it's actually painted silver. So that's something you can do. Some of the pipes down here painted silver. The running board, the edge of it is painted silver. Handrails painted silver. This is Denver Rio Grande Western's way of doing things. A plate like that where you step is silver. The edge of the pilot itself is silver. These are done to bring out these details, and so that it's obvious for the workers. So the handrails here, where a worker needs to grab to lift himself up, they painted them silver for contrast. And here you can see that a little bit of detail of an armrest. The front of the cylinders they painted silver. Now it wasn't a uniform silver, it was pretty messy, but it was still painted silver. Little details like these release valves or whatever they are, steam cocks, I'm not quite sure what they are. Now at this point I'm going to be playing with an airbrush, but I want to caution you on this. You don't have to use an airbrush on your model, but a lot of people like to do it. So I've got Floquil Earth, and what I'm doing is I'm putting very light coats on there. Now if you want a dusty appearance to your earth, then pass one time, let it dry, come back, make another light pass, let it dry, and come back and make another light pass. But for the purpose of the video here, I'm doing it and weathering it and giving it a fairly heavy coat. Now you can see I've painted that box earlier, but the paint has already disappeared from it. This is a mix of about 1 part Floquil Earth with about 3 or 4 parts of the Floquil thinner. So very light amounts. Now here, can you see that I've put tape over the axles on the tender? I've wrapped those in tape so that the paint doesn't get on there. And I'm not putting large amounts of paint on there, just very small amounts. I just wanted to show what you can do with an airbrush, but on most of these models you've noticed I haven't used an airbrush. At this point I'm doing here, it's actually going to end up a little heavy. Now what I'm doing here is applying some voltage to it just to get the drivers to turn a little bit so that I can expose some more area so that I can paint it again. On this overspray like this, you want to be very careful. It adds a lot of color in a hurry, and experiment with this. Spray on things that are white, spray on things that are black, or even like the box here, that green. What I discovered years ago when doing using an airbrush, you need to keep something black handy, because as you're doing this change goes on these paints go on so light and so subtly that you don't really notice it. And then what happens is you look at your locomotive later, and all of a sudden it looks like it's way too light color. So just getting these tires to turn a little bit again. Want to make sure that we get an even application. Now see, it doesn't look like I'm adding a lot of paint here, does I? It looks like I'm being fairly discreet with it. And I am putting it on lightly, but it actually ends up being white gray. Not gray, but earth color. I like the Floquil earth color for this. Now I got a little heavy on my application here, even though you can't really tell, but it is pretty heavy. If you look at that power pack over there that's black and compare that to the locomotive, you see this locomotive is really quite a bit grayer. This is where you have to be careful. You have to decide how much you want to apply. I like to have quite a bit of an overspray just so it changes the color of the locomotive. But if you stop before doing this overspray with the airbrush, you may like that finished locomotive better. So go ahead and color it and weather it. Don't do this overspray until you've looked at it and decide how much overspray you want to have on it. So working on the ends. Now on the ends you get a certain amount of dust that comes from the rolling stock behind it, throwing it up. Just hard to demonstrate and to tell you exactly how much to add here. You can see this quite clearly, but this is virtually all thinner. Very little paint. You can see on the green box down there how it just changed the color a little bit. Okay, now having done the bottom and letting it dry, then you want to come back over the top of the locomotive and do more. Now a light coat like where it is right there, that's probably an excellent place to stop. But if you like to have it heavier, then add some more to it. But that right there, that looks pretty good. That's about the way it should be. Now I do my spray painting outdoors. I don't use a paint booth. I just can't have any of these kind of smells inside the house. We've got too many allergies. So you go around your locomotive, make sure you give it a light color coating all the way over, all the way around, and just get it, be sure to stop. A secret, this is the secret for weathering. Weather it a bit and stop. Let it dry. Then take it and put it in your layout room. Look at it on your layout. See if it looks good enough. If it does, quit. So one of the secrets of any kind of painting or weathering is do a certain amount and then stop. If you continue to do it, you're often going to make a mistake. Now here, I've looked at the finished model. The paint here is set up, and I decided I had too much of that dust effect right here on this steam chest. So I took some of the not the testers, but the Floquil thinner and a stiff brush and just going over that area and removing it. Then I'm putting a thin coat of the Flocal Earth mixed with the thinner, and just going over and do this back and forth. Apply the paint, then take it, dry your brush off, and then remove as much of the paint you need until it gets just the way you want it to look. It's a pretty good view of the boiler, showing the different stains and everything on the boiler. And again, you may not want your locomotive this heavily weathered, or you may want it more heavily weathered. Just stop when it gets to the point to where you think it looks right. I'm spending a little bit of extra time on this steam chest because since I'm working with a brush here, it's not quite the same as using the airbrush. Now you can take an airbrush and set it very fine and just go back and spray this again. But often it's not worth the effort to do that. You can just, working with a brush, just go back and forth using the small amount of paint that's on there until you spread it. Then what you have to do at some point is you have to stop, let it dry, and see how it looks to you. Okay, we're going to let that dry and see how that looks. I'm going to take off a little bit more. It's all subjective. Take off a bit more, and we're going to let that dry while we do some work on the rest of the locomotive. Our paints are all set, so now we remove the micro scale micro mask. And to do that, you just press a bit of masking tape right to it. See how easily that popped off? And you can tell when it comes off because it's blue. Now, after we've given the locomotive a complete overspray, I'm now going back with more of these chalks. Now, these chalks, this is the Bragdon chalk that you just apply. You don't need to put another overspray at the top of this. And just rub it in on the boiler. And you don't want to get carried away with this, but you want it certainly to look like it's been used. And you can actually take that and do some other work. Now here on the steam chest, I got to looking at it again, decided I'd better take the paint off and put it on again, because the way that builds up there, that just well, you just got to play with it until you get it just the way you want. So here I'm just going for a much lighter coat. Just like that. Just empty out some of the paint from your brush by dragging it across the surface. Absorb the slop. And that's about right. Now, of course, I could have just taken some of the black powder and scrubbed it over this area to darken it, get rid of so much of the tan look. Well, that's it. Hope you've enjoyed what we've done here. We've weathered 4 locomotives. Should give you some good ideas. The main thing, again, is to practice and weather for a while and then stop and look at it. And then if you think it needs more, go ahead and add more. So much easier to add more than it is to remove. Well, thank you again. Now, here we got one last shot. This is of the locomotive in my layout room. So, thanks a lot. See you at a convention sometime. Hope you had fun.